It started with a knock I almost didn't answer. Saturday morning, 9:14 a.m., the sun barely breaking over the rows of cookie-cutter houses in Maple Grove Estates, our pristine little subdivision in Clearwater, Florida. I had a mug of coffee in one hand, still wearing my faded college t-shirt, when I opened the door to find Mark Benson, 56, HOA board president, khakis so sharply creased they could cut glass, and that same faint cologne he wore to every meeting. He wasn't smiling. "I'm afraid we need to talk about your shed," he said, as though announcing a death. My shed. The one I'd spent an entire weekend building with my brother, Eli, 32, last summer. The one that sat tucked in the corner of my backyard, next to the old oak tree where my daughter hung her tire swing. It was painted a cheerful shade of butter yellow, nothing wild, nothing neon, at least, not yet. "What about it?" I asked, sipping my coffee. Mark held out a clipboard like it was evidence in a criminal trial. "We've received multiple complaints that the color is disruptive to the visual harmony of the neighborhood." I laughed because it sounded ridiculous. Visual harmony? "Mark, it's a shed, not a disco ball." He didn't laugh back. "The HOA guidelines are clear. All outbuildings must be painted in colors consistent with the community's approved palette." There was the phrase every homeowner in this neighborhood had heard at least once, the approved palette. A dull collection of grays, browns, and off-whites, colors so uninspired they could suck the joy out of a birthday party. "You've got 30 days to repaint," he said, "or there will be fines." And then, without so much as a goodbye, he turned and walked down my driveway. I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, wondering how in the world a patch of yellow paint could offend someone enough to lodge a complaint. Welcome to Fenceline Story, where the battles aren't fought in courtrooms or back alleys, but across lawns, fences, and neighborhood meetings. Tell me where you're watching this video from, hit that like button, and subscribe for more stories like this one. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't about the shed anymore. It was about the principle of it, the absurdity of a group of neighbors dictating the color of a structure that nobody could see from the street unless they leaned over my fence like a nosy inspector. I replayed the scene in my mind, over and over. Mark standing there like some kind of suburban sheriff, ready to enforce law and order on a backyard shed. But the thing is, I knew he didn't just enforce rules because he believed in them. He enforced them because it made him feel powerful. The more I thought about it, the more it burned. It wasn't just my shed under attack. This was a story I'd heard before. Linda Rodriguez, 44, fined for planting roses instead of HOA-approved azaleas. Tommy and Rachel Clark, both in their 30s, threatened with legal action because their kid's basketball hoop wasn't permanent enough. The HOA always framed it as protecting property values, but everyone knew it was about control. The great question began to form in my mind. How far will I go to keep a little freedom in my own backyard? The next day, I took a slow walk around the neighborhood. Maple Grove Estates looked like it had been copy-pasted from a real estate brochure, every house identical except for the tiniest variations in trim and shutters. Lawns were edged to military precision, driveways power-washed to perfection. Even the air felt policed. But behind those picture-perfect facades, I could feel it, the quiet resentment. The whispered complaints. The way people lowered their voices when they mentioned the HOA. That afternoon, I found myself staring at the shed for a long time. I imagined repainting it in one of their bland, approved colors. I imagined bending the knee, giving Mark his little victory, and moving on. And then, I imagined something else. If the HOA thought my yellow shed was disruptive, what would they do if I made it truly unforgettable? A shed so loud, so unapologetically bright, that no one in Maple Grove Estates could pretend not to see it. The thought made me smile. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the fight began. Not in the meeting room, not in front of the board, but here, in my own mind, standing in my backyard as the Florida sun set behind me. The rules said I had 30 days to repaint. I decided to use every single one of them, and then some. The war over my shed was about to begin. And I wasn't planning to play by their rules. The next HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige brick building that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and artificial vanilla. I hadn't been to one in months. Usually I avoided them like the flu. But that night, I walked in with my notepad tucked under my arm, ready to listen. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the shift. Heads turned. Conversations paused. People glanced at me the way diners look at someone who's just walked into a restaurant wearing pajamas. Mark Benson sat at the center of the long folding table, flanked by Janice Miller, 59, treasurer, floral blouses for every occasion, and Derek Walters, 47, vice president, former realtor, perfect hair. Their expressions were tight, like they were already bracing for a storm. Next order of business, Mark said, tapping a stack of papers. We've received multiple concerns regarding an unapproved shed color on Lot 18. His eyes flicked to me. I raised my hand before he could continue. It's yellow. That's all it is. Not fluorescent, not spray painted with graffiti. Just yellow. It's buttercup, Janice corrected, reading from a paper. And according to our color compliance chart, buttercup is not on the approved palette. I stared at her. Do you hear yourselves? We're talking about a shed that sits behind my house. You can't even see it from the road unless you're trying. Derek leaned forward. It's not just about you, sir. The rules exist to maintain uniformity. That's what keeps property values stable. There it was again, property values. The HOA's holy scripture. But I'd lived here long enough to know that uniformity wasn't just about appearances. It was about control. Later that week, I stopped by Linda Rodriguez's house. She lived 3 doors down and had been in her own HOA battle last spring. They fined me $100 a day, she said, pouring sweet tea into 2 mason jars. Because I planted roses. Actual roses. You'd think I'd installed a barbed wire fence around the place. She leaned in, lowering her voice. It's not about the roses, or your shed. It's about showing everyone who's in charge. They pick a target, make an example out of them. Keeps the rest of the neighborhood in line. I thought back to something I'd noticed at the meeting, how quiet everyone else had been. Not one person spoke up. Not because they agreed with the board, but because they didn't want to be next. The more I dug, the clearer it became. This shed thing was just the surface. Mark had been president for 7 years, re-elected every single time because no one else wanted the job badly enough to fight him for it. Under his leadership, the rules had gotten stricter, the fines higher, and the list of unapproved things longer. Noise complaints for kids playing basketball. Fines for improperly stored bicycles. Threatening letters for a single missing shingle on a roof. It wasn't just irritating. It was oppressive. And the scariest part? It worked. People complied. People kept their heads down. They repainted, replanted, removed, and replaced without question, because the HOA always made it sound like resistance would cost you more than it was worth. One evening, while sitting on my porch watching the street lamps flicker on, I realized something. The shed wasn't just my problem anymore. This was about every neighbor who had been bullied into silence. Every time someone had to give up a small piece of their home because it didn't fit the HOA's idea of harmony. Every time a board member reminded us that we didn't just own our property, we shared it with their rules. That's when the anger shifted into resolve. I wasn't going to just repaint my shed and move on. I was going to push back. The HOA had drawn their line in the sand. I was about to cross it, and I wanted the whole neighborhood to see. But before I could act, I had to understand something crucial. If I stood up to them, they wouldn't just come after the shed. They would come after me. My family. My peace. The question was, how much was I willing to risk to prove a point? It started small, a few sideways glances when I walked past certain neighbors. The kind of look you give someone when you've read something about them on Facebook but aren't sure if it's true. Then came the silence. Mrs. Kendall, 68, lived across the street, always the first to wave in the mornings, stopped waving entirely. Tommy Clark, who used to come over for beers on Friday nights, suddenly became too busy. At the playground, my daughter noticed the other kids' parents pulling them away just a little too soon. It was as if Mark Benson had quietly declared me the neighborhood troublemaker, and people believed it. One morning, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. No signature. Just 3 words, written in sharp, slanted handwriting. Follow the rules. That same week, the HOA sent me 2 separate violation notices. One for overgrown grass, even though I'd mowed 2 days earlier, and another for visible trash cans because I'd taken them to the curb too early. It was clear they weren't just enforcing the shed rule anymore. They were watching me, looking for anything they could use to pile on the pressure. But the worst part wasn't the fines or the notes. It was the way the neighborhood itself began to change. The monthly HOA meeting turned into a spectator sport. Neighbors who never attended before started showing up, whispering in the back, waiting to see what would happen next. It was less about resolving issues and more about seeing if Mark would win. Linda Rodriguez warned me it would happen. "They make you the villain," she said. "People are scared of siding with you because if you lose, they lose too. Nobody wants to be next on the list." At home, the tension seeped into everything. My wife, Claire, 35, tried to stay neutral at first, but the letters, the whispers, the way other moms avoided her at the school pickup line, it wore her down. "Maybe you should just repaint it," she said one night over dinner, her voice soft but heavy. "Just to end it." I stared at my plate, my fork unmoving. I knew she meant well. But every part of me rejected the idea. This wasn't about paint anymore. I couldn't ignore the truth. The HOA wasn't just inconveniencing me. They were isolating us. Slowly, methodically. And that's when I realized they weren't going to stop. Not unless I made them. By the end of that week, I had a plan. It wasn't about fighting quietly or behind closed doors. If the HOA wanted to make me an example, I was going to give them a spectacle they'd never forget. The decision came to me late one night, sitting in the dim light of my garage with a cold beer in hand. The shed was visible through the window, its cheerful butter yellow paint almost glowing in the moonlight. If Mark Benson wanted it gone, then it wouldn't just stay. It would come back louder, brighter, unignorable. I grabbed my phone and sent a single text to my brother Eli. "Need your help. Operation Glow Shed is a go." "Eli, I'm in. What's the plan?" The first step wasn't paint. It was evidence. For the next week, I started keeping a log of every interaction with the HOA, every violation notice, every conversation, every sideways glance from Mark. I photographed my lawn after mowing, my trash cans neatly placed by the curb, my mailbox in perfect condition. If they were going to wage a petty war, I was going to make sure they couldn't twist the truth. At the same time, I began quietly reaching out to my neighbors, the ones I suspected had been on the receiving end of the HOA's iron fist. Linda was my first ally. Then came the Clarks, who still hadn't forgiven the board for banning their kids' basketball hoop. Slowly, a small group began to form, people who were tired of keeping their heads down. We met in garages, on back patios, even at the local coffee shop 2 towns over so no one would overhear us. We swapped stories, shared letters, compared fines. It turned out Mark and his board weren't just strict, they were selective. Certain neighbors seemed to skate by without consequences while others got buried in notices. By the 3rd week, I was ready for the next phase, the paint. I didn't go to a big box store. I drove 45 minutes to a specialty shop that catered to theatrical set designers and bought 3 gallons of the brightest, most unapologetically neon green paint I could find. The kind of color that would make traffic cones jealous. When Eli saw it, his grin was so wide I thought his face might split. "You're gonna need sunglasses just to look at this thing." We waited until a Friday evening, when the sun was low and the neighborhood had retreated indoors. Then, under the cover of dusk, we got to work. Brush strokes turned the soft yellow into radioactive green. It glowed even in the fading light, a beacon of defiance. By midnight, the shed looked like it had been plucked straight from a sci-fi movie. Saturday morning, I brewed coffee, sat on my porch and waited. It didn't take long. At 9:03 a.m., Mark appeared at the end of my driveway, his face frozen somewhere between disbelief and fury. Behind him, other neighbors peeked through blinds or lingered on sidewalks pretending to walk their dogs. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice tight. "It's within 30 days, I reminded him, sipping my coffee. "You told me to repaint." "I did." "That's not..." He stopped himself, visibly recalculating. "This color is not within the approved palette." Your letter didn't specify an approved color, I said, holding up the original violation notice. Just said I had to repaint. Guess we'll need to bring this up at the next meeting. The muscle in his jaw twitched. He turned and walked away without another word. That night, the texts started rolling in from my little rebellion group. Linda, legend. Tommy, I almost spit out my beer when I saw it. Rachel, they're going to lose their minds. And they did. Over the next week, I received 3 new letters, each more desperate than the last, demanding I repaint in accordance with community guidelines. I ignored them. Politely. Instead, I posted a photo of the shed on the neighborhood Facebook page with the caption, "Repainted as requested. Thoughts?" The comments lit up. Some praised me for standing up to the HOA. Others accused me of ruining the community's aesthetic. But the real win was that people were finally talking, out loud, in public, about the board's overreach. The HOA had wanted to make me an example. They had. Just, not the way they intended. But I knew this was only the beginning. They wouldn't back down. Not yet. And I was ready for whatever came next. The night of the monthly HOA meeting, the clubhouse parking lot was overflowing. I'd never seen it like that. Cars lined up along the street, neighbors walking in groups, the buzz of conversation filling the humid Florida air. When I stepped inside, every seat was taken. People stood in the back, leaning against walls, fanning themselves with folded papers. And in the center of it all sat Mark Benson, looking like a man determined to wrestle back control. He cleared his throat. "We have an urgent matter to address, the egregious violation of community guidelines by the resident of Lot 18. That was my cue. I walked to the front, my notepad in hand, and turned to face the room instead of the board. "I know what this is about," I began, my voice steady. "My shed. Or rather, the fact that it's bright green. But this isn't about paint. It never was." A few heads nodded in the crowd. "This is about power. About selective enforcement. About a board that has fined people for basketball hoops, flowers, garden gnomes, while letting others slide. This shed has become a symbol because it's the first thing in years that hasn't been met with quiet compliance." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "We're here to discuss." "No," I cut in. "We're here to discuss why so many of us are scared to speak up. Why rules meant to protect property values have turned into a way to control people's lives. And why this board feels it can make arbitrary decisions without accountability." From the back, Linda spoke up. "He's right. They fine me for planting roses. And I know I'm not the only one." Then Tommy. "They made me take down my kid's basketball hoop. Said it was a hazard. We all know it wasn't." One voice after another joined in. Stories spilled out, building momentum, filling the room with a current that even Mark couldn't cut through. When it quieted, I laid my notepad on the table in front of the board. These are documented instances of inconsistent enforcement over the past year. Names, dates, photos, letters. If this board wants to talk about rules, we should start with applying them fairly. Mark's jaw tightened. Even if some enforcement has been inconsistent, that does not excuse your blatant disregard for the guidelines. I smiled. "You told me to repaint the shed." "I did. You didn't specify a color in your letter. That's your oversight, not mine." A few people laughed. Others clapped quietly. The meeting spiraled from there, not into chaos, but into something more dangerous for the board: conversation. Neighbors began debating, questioning, suggesting changes. Someone even proposed holding a vote for new leadership at the next election cycle. Mark tried to steer things back, but the control was slipping. The fear was gone. By the time I walked out, the air felt lighter. People stopped me on the sidewalk to shake my hand, to thank me. A few even asked how they could get a copy of my notes. The shed still stood there, glowing like an alien beacon in the night, and for the first time, I saw it for what it really was: not an eyesore, not a provocation, but proof. Proof that one person refusing to back down could make others realize they didn't have to either. A month later, the board sent me one last letter. This one wasn't a fine. It was an amendment to the guidelines, effective immediately. All repainting must be approved in writing before work begins. Petty? Sure. But it was also proof they'd been forced to change something. Claire stood beside me on the porch as I read it. So, what now? You gonna change the color? I looked at the shed, the late afternoon sun making it glow even brighter. Not a chance. She smiled, the first real one since this all started, and squeezed my hand. I don't kid myself into thinking the war is over. HOAs don't just disappear, and power doesn't surrender easily. But things feel different now. Neighbors wave again. People talk more openly at meetings. The board knows it can be challenged. And every time I step into my backyard, that neon green shed reminds me of the moment I stopped being afraid to push back. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Sometimes the fight isn't about winning outright. Sometimes it's about refusing to lose quietly. Because in neighborhoods like Maple Grove Estates, freedom isn't taken all at once. It's chipped away, a flower here, a basketball hoop there, a shed color they don't like. And if you're not careful, one day you'll look around and realize your home doesn't feel like it belongs to you anymore. I wasn't willing to let that happen. Not then. Not ever.